Conor McGregor didn't lose his prime in a fight. He signed it away. Not with blood, not with damage, with ink. At the peak of his power, double champion, untouchable aura, precision no one could decode. He made a decision that didn't look like surrender. It looked like ambition. While the division prepared for title defenses, he prepared for paydays. While contenders studied his timing, he studied revenue splits. Champions defend their throne. Brands expand their reach. The moment he signed to box Floyd Mayweather, he stopped being a reigning predator and started becoming a global product. Two different mentalities. Two different hungers. And hunger is what made him dangerous. He didn't get knocked out of his prime. He stepped out of it. The octagon demands obsession. Boxing offered spectacle. He chose spectacle. He chose scale. He chose magnitude. He chose money. And in that choice, something subtle shifted. The edge that terrified champions began negotiating contracts instead of cutting weight. That was the beginning, not of defeat, of comfort. And comfort is where killers go to retire. Before the money, Conor McGregor was obsessed. Not with cameras, not with headlines, with domination. He trained like a man chasing survival. Every movement sharpened, every round deliberate, every prediction backed by preparation. Hunger defined him. He studied opponents with surgical detail, built rhythm traps, controlled distance like a mathematician. But fame changes the texture of motivation. Once the world calls you global icon, the internal voice softens. The urgency that once screamed starts negotiating. After the Mayweather spectacle, the calendar filled differently. Press tours, whiskey launches, media obligations. Camp lengths shifted. Focus fragmented. The discipline that once felt automatic became optional. And optional discipline is the first crack in dominance. He was still talented, still dangerous. But danger without obsession becomes performance. And performance is different from war. The early Conor fought to conquer. The later Conor fought to maintain. That shift is invisible on paper. But inside a fighter's mind, it changes everything. The body follows belief. And belief was no longer about proving. It was about preserving, and preservation never built greatness. Discipline is fragile. It doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes. Quietly, gradually, almost politely. After fame reached its peak, the environment around Conor changed. He was no longer just a fighter, he was an empire. Businesses demanded presence, interviews demanded personality, fans demanded spectacle. The gym was no longer the only arena. And when your identity expands, your focus divides. Division kills sharpness. In his early run, everything pointed toward one objective: win. Later, objectives multiplied. Protect the brand. Grow the brand. Monetize the brand. Training camps became part of a larger schedule, not the center of existence. Obsession cannot coexist with distraction. Even small fractures in routine compound over time. Sleep shifts, recovery shortens, intensity fluctuates. At the highest level, tiny margins decide everything. You don't lose greatness in one night, you dilute it. And dilution is subtle. He still talked like a predator, still dressed like a king. But kings who start counting profits rarely count rounds the same way. The sharp edge that once cut through divisions was now surrounded by comfort. And comfort does not sharpen blades, it cushions them. And cushioned fighters don't rule for long. Talent hides decay, for a while. Against lesser opposition, natural ability can still shine. Timing still flashes. Power still threatens. Aura still intimidates. But elite fighters don't fight aura. They fight patterns, and patterns expose truth. When Conor stepped back into real contention, the margins were thinner. Pressure felt different. Pace felt heavier. Resistance didn't fold. The opponents had evolved. They weren't intimidated by press conferences. They weren't frozen by prediction. They came prepared for war, and war punishes hesitation. The rhythm that once looked effortless now required effort. The pull counters weren't as clean, the exits weren't as sharp, the composure wasn't as automatic. At the highest level, reaction time is everything, and reaction time depends on repetition. Repetition depends on obsession. Obsession had been divided. You could see it in moments, small pauses, micro delays, seconds that didn't exist before. Greatness survives chaos, but it does not survive compromise. And inside the cage, compromise becomes visible. Not immediately, but inevitably. The crowd still saw Conor McGregor, but the cage was starting to see something else. The cracks inside the cage didn't begin in the cage. They began years earlier, when Conor discovered he could generate more outside the octagon than inside it. From that moment on, training stopped being survival. It became selective excellence. Hesitation doesn't appear randomly. Lost rhythm doesn't materialize overnight. Slower reactions grow when repetition decreases, and repetition decreases when focus splits. Conor didn't forget how to fight. He stopped structuring his entire life around fighting. Before fame, everything fed performance. After fame, performance had to share space. Businesses expanded, appearances multiplied, responsibilities grew. The body adapts to priority. If war is no longer the center, your nervous system recalibrates. Inside the cage, that shows up in fractions. Fractions decide fights. The division didn't suddenly outgrow him. They remained obsessed. He diversified. And obsession always defeats diversification in combat sports. This wasn't a collapse, it was a trade. Comfort for sharpness, security for danger, and every trade has a cost. Fame doesn't just change schedule, it changes self-perception. When the world calls you the biggest star in combat sports, discipline stops feeling mandatory. It starts feeling beneath you. Early Conor needed to prove he belonged. Later, Conor assumed he did. That difference is lethal, because hunger feeds on insecurity. Security feeds ego, and ego whispers dangerous things. You've already done enough. You've already conquered. You don't need to suffer like before. Suffering built him, but comfort convinced him he had graduated from it. The gym no longer represented survival, it represented maintenance. And maintenance is not war preparation. War requires humility. Humility requires doubt. Doubt forces work. When doubt disappears, so does desperation, and desperation is fuel. You could see it in demeanor. The sharp unpredictability softened. The chaotic genius became calculated confidence. Confidence without desperation is slower, less reactive, less vicious. He still believed in himself, but belief without urgency does not intimidate killers, because the new generation wasn't impressed. They weren't chasing spotlight. They were chasing blood. And blood beats brand when the cage door closes. While Conor was building visibility, the sport was building resistance. He wasn't facing the same division anymore. He was facing a generation raised watching him. They memorized his pull counters, they drilled his rhythm, they prepared specifically for the myth. The element of surprise was gone, and surprise had always been one of his sharpest weapons. What once looked mystical now looked studied. What once looked unpredictable now looked rehearsed. The division didn't hate him, it simply stopped fearing him. And fear is currency in combat sports. When opponents stop freezing in front of you, they start advancing. They pressure, they test, they extend rounds. They make you work in places you no longer enjoy working. The aura faded first, then the control, then the inevitability. By the time the results shifted, the internal shift had already happened years before. The sport had modernized quietly. Cardio deeper, game plans tighter, defenses smarter. Meanwhile, Conor was carrying history on his back. And history is heavy. Heavy fighters react slower, and in modern MMA, slow is fatal. Greatness is expensive, not financially, mentally. It demands obsession without distraction. It demands sacrifice without applause. It demands repetition long after the world is already impressed. Conor McGregor once paid that price. Then he discovered something else. He could win without bleeding. He could dominate headlines without dominating rounds. He could expand without enduring. And that is where the decision lived. Not in a single fight, not in a single night, but in a quiet shift of priority. Fame or hunger. Security or sacrifice. Empire or evolution. He chose expansion, and expansion diluted obsession. This isn't about disrespect, it's about trajectory. One path leads to sustained greatness. The other leads to sustained visibility. Both are powerful. Only one survives inside a cage. Conor didn't fall because he lacked talent. He stepped away from the conditions that built it. And once those conditions disappear, so does inevitability. In combat sports, decline rarely begins with damage. It begins with comfort, and comfort is a decision. Every empire is built on one. Every decline begins with one. On this channel, we study that moment. The moment everything changes, one decision.